That makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And it could be a number of things. So the most likely culprit to that is in 2010, the dolphins weren't exposed to oil, so they were nice and fertile. You know, they hadn't ran into any issues, so they were able to get pregnant in 2010. Then they lost those, we call them calves, those babies, within that year. And then those coming years, if you're metabolically stressed, nutritionally stressed, if there's contaminants that are preventing you from ovulating or making semen, then you're going to run into actually having issues getting pregnant versus having issues maintaining a pregnancy. So it could be that their reproductive success or ability to get pregnant decreased. So if you have less pregnant dolphins in 2012, 13, and 14, the percentage or the raw number of animals you're going to see is less, but potentially the number of dolphins that were actually able to get pregnant still lost a large percentage of those animals. That's the most likely cause. The other cause or potential cause is that level of effort in doing stranding responses in 2012 potentially could have been decreased. So we had a bunch of people on the water, a bunch of people cleaning up the beaches. So if they came across carcasses in those first year or two, we would get those reports. But then when the cleanup kind of died down a little bit, there were less people on the beaches. So maybe the reporting and monitoring decreased.
Also,
good question.
In your bar graphs, where you showed the breakdown in the deaths between Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida, there seemed to be a really unusual occurrence for Mississippi and higher than the others. Yeah. How do you account for that? Mississippi only has maybe a quarter of the seashore of Louisiana and
yeah. Yep, it is 80 miles of beautiful beach that people frequent and that is easily accessible in Mississippi. If you go to the bayou in Louisiana, it's a different world out there. So the ability to pick up carcasses, the fact that there's less people in the bayou areas and that bird foot of Louisiana decreases our chances of seeing carcasses. And also, obviously, the dolphins don't respect state lines, but our stranding networks do. So the level of, the level of effort in Louisiana is much lower. Their stranding response was run by Louisiana Fish and Wildlife, so a state entity. Whereas in Mississippi, the stranding response is run by the Institute of Marine Mammal Studies, an aquarium, and they're much better funded and have a lot more people to go out and collect those animals. So
I also note that there's maybe a lot more coastline in Louisiana, but Mississippi also has the barrier islands, so that adds coastline in each area that boats are going out to more regularly, and there's not a lot of beach.
Yeah.
Well, here we're like at the barrier island, there's not beach.
The people online are asking if you all can
people online are asking for the people asking questions to use the microphone so they can hear or repeat the question. And there is a question online right behind you on the screen. Are the animal models that can reveal effects on marine mammals, dolphins and others, and reptiles? Okay. Are the animal models that can reveal effects on marine animals, dolphins and others, and reptiles? For example, would the liver from a rat or mouse be helpful in understanding hepatic lesions or hepatic metabolic capacity in a dolphin, and likewise from the liver of a bird to a reptile?
Yeah, it's comparable. We have lab models that we study diseases in all the time, and there's different idiosyncrasies behind using a rat to represent what happens in a dolphin, a fish. But there are, especially with, I'm trying to think of a word. So if you're in utero and you're developing birth defects as a result of a toxin, a lot of those birth defects can be cross species. But when you look at the effects on organs of animals that are more spread out evolutionarily speaking, it's less comparable. So Dolphins are very similar to mice, so they're both mammals. So a mice would be a decent model for a dolphin. But when you start trying to translate that to the next level down, which would potentially be fish, or sorry, birds and reptiles, it would be a little bit less of a good model. But it's still, nobody's going to let us put a sea turtle or a dolphin in a tank and expose it to oil, not these days at least. So we have to do the best we can with what we have. So we either try and study them in situ when they're out in the environment, or we have models that are a little bit more socially acceptable to study, like mice and rats.
I do have another question on that. You have had about 50 to 60 people online through the whole event. So, please comment on the effect of cold weather conditions and freshwater inundations in 2010 and 11 that complicated the picture for dolphin mortalities relative to the Deepwater Horizon event.
I don't want to take up all the spotlight. You guys are more than welcome to talk. So like I said, there's multi-factors that influence animals in their environment. It's hard to tease those things out. Cold and fresh water do have significant impacts on the health of the animals along our coast, and we're currently seeing some of those issues. So in 2010, 2011, it was a cold winter in 2010, and there was it was a very rainy, wet season. So there was a lot of freshwater runoff, there was very cold temperatures, and then that in combination with the exposure to oil could have resulted in confounding variables that caused even higher mortality rates than if any of those individual things happened separately. So a good example of that is what we're seeing right now. There's been a lot of freshwater runoff into the Mississippi Sound as a result of having a really wet season. And so we're seeing a die-off of an unusual mortality event of dolphins associated with increased runoff. And we're trying to work out exactly why that's killing animals. But if we put an oil spill on top of that, we would obviously see additional issues. So it's really hard to tease those things out. So yes, it probably did have an impact on it. The unusual mortality event, at least of the marine mammals, and definitely of the turtles as well. They kind of turn off when it becomes cold. They get cold stunned, and their metabolism shuts off and they don't breathe as well. They get pneumonia. So you can have those compounding variables. So if you're starting off with a population that's already got a bunch of stressors, and then you add on a massive stressor like an oil spill, you're going to see increased mortalities. So it would have been better for all of them, I think, if it was a warmer winter that year.
And they did say even with the microphone to repeat the question, it sounds really garbled.
I think this is for Dr. Kendall.
I repeat the question. So we did most of our work on beaches, and the question is whether similar work was done on other coastlines that had different sediments and different vegetation. There has been a lot of work. There was a great interest, of course, in salt marsh, and also in areas where in previous oil spills where we had mangrove, not in this oil spill, but the sediment composition, of course, is very critical. So if you have a marsh sediment that's very fine-grained and is anoxic or without any oxygen just below the surface, and the oil gets embedded there, then the degradation process can be very, very slow. So there have been long-time studies in the literature that were known before this oil spill. For instance, a spill that happened near Woods Hole, where they observed oil spill consequences for more than 3 decades. And they found in the salt marsh sediments there was hardly any degradation going on. As compared to these oxic sediments that we observed, we were surprised how rapidly that would go. After the Deepwater Horizon, there was a lot of attention given to the salt marsh sediments. And in the salt marsh, similar things were found. It would not last as long as in Woods Hole, where the temperatures are colder and where we have also different fauna in the salt marsh. But it's definitely much longer than in the sands. The sandy sediments occur where you have an exposed coast. So that means there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of mixing, there's a lot of moving of the sediment around. If you have a salt marsh, that's very different. It's a sedimentary coast where the sediment sits in place and it's not changed a lot. And when the oil is penetrating in these sediments, for instance, through crab burrows and so forth, you may have pockets of oil. When those close up, then the oil is basically encapsulated in anoxic sediment and can stay for very long. So after the X-Stock in the Gulf, the oil spill that happened further south, it was observed that in salt marsh sediments, as well as in mangrove sediments, which are also very high in organic carbon, and so they are also anoxic, the oil would persist for a very long time. So people after the Deepwater Horizon did comparisons. They went to sites of the X-Stock where oil was buried and found liquid oil in some parts and oil that was not very well degraded in these anoxic pockets. So there's a very, very dramatic difference between those two.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Since we're on that topic, are any of your findings new to oil spill science, or is the science always new because every spill is different on the decay rates?
The latter catches it better. So the principles are known. It's very different because the degradation depends so much on the environmental conditions. And so the specific site where you go will always have different characteristics that are very influential, as well as the characteristics of the oil. We were very lucky, so to speak, with this oil because it's highly degradable. Other oils have more of the components that Dick Snyder introduced, like the asphaltenes and the resins that were relatively low in this oil. If you have more of that in the oil, then it persists also very much longer. This oil was a feast for the microbes. And so they, as we found in our sediments, the microbes exploded after they got in contact with this oil. We had these enormous numbers. And that reflects nothing but that the oil was an excellent substrate for this microbial community that degraded it relatively rapidly. That's why we found that after a year, at least these small particles were gone mostly.
Yeah. To me, that explains, to have that information specific to each oil spill is helpful and important to know, so that we know how the oil is degrading as time goes on.
So this next question is for Dr. Snyder, which means someone's going to need to read it into that microphone for him to hear it. It is right behind us on the screen. I don't know if you all can read it.
Okay. Dr. Snyder, are you familiar with abnormal effects caused by the bioaccumulation of petroleum PAHs, the putative, more toxic hydrocarbons in clams or other lower invertebrates that don't have the enzymatic machinery to metabolize PAHs? Is there a BCF that could be equated with a toxic effect, understanding that bioaccumulation alone is not necessary and irreversibly toxic event? I don't know if I did that well enough.
No, I don't know that information personally, and as I stated before, the values we saw for PAHs in the Donax tissue is a good indicator of the bioavailable PAHs in the intertidal zone, and none of those values were any higher than we saw in, for example, in oysters inside Pensacola Bay. So I wouldn't have expected to see any adverse effects in the clams out on the beaches. Now, over in Louisiana, where Marcus was just talking about, where the oil gets into anaerobic spaces and persists, you get some mollusks like salt marsh mussels, Dukensia, that lives in the salt marshes. Organisms like that may have had effects that people studying the salt marshes would have documented. But along the sandy beaches, we really didn't see concentrations high enough to cause any effects.
I do have one question. We asked some of our registrants if they have any other questions that they'd like to ask our speakers, and jot those down. And so I have a more general question, but Dr. Hugh, I'm not sure if you can answer, but they're asking how much crude oil is still on the seafloor and what impacts does that have to basically sea life on the seafloor? I don't know if you can talk on that.
I wish I knew, but there are estimates. There's about, depending on what literature you read, about 20 to 30% of the oil unaccounted for. And that, most of that oil will be on the seafloor, not necessarily close to here because it was taken away by water currents, so it was deposited on the seafloor, and that of course causes concerns. For one thing, it's easy to go to the beach and to investigate oil, but it's not so easy to go to the deep sea floor and investigate oil. And so there have been some studies in our department. Jeff Chanton has been investigating deep sea cores and looked at oil and looked at isotopic signatures to make maps of the Gulf of Mexico seafloor to see where oil might have accumulated. And that gives us some idea where it ended up. And a lot of that oil ended up very close to the well, of course, but then you can see the main currents that took it in different directions and distributed it. It's difficult to say what kind of impact it has on the long run. It's clear that if you put oil in the refrigerator, which is basically what the deep sea is, that would take longer to degrade. And then these sediments are also fine-grained sediments mostly, and there's relatively little current, so it sits on the top of the surface, and it can have various effects. So the microbes may like it. They will digest it as they would do in shallower environments, but then of course all the other organisms that take up toxic substances may suffer. And there are some investigations that show, for instance, that deep sea corals were badly impacted close to the well where the oil attached to these corals, and also that this oil snow that happened after the oil spill, when oil got in contact with particles in the water column and also picked up more water, then became heavy again and was populated by microbes, and that formed so-called oil snow. So there was a drizzle of flux that contained oil and hydrocarbons to the deep sea floor, and that settled on the deep sea floor. And then if that gets then entangled, for instance, with deep sea corals, it had negative effects. What the infauna does, the worms and mollusks, polychaetes that live in there, that depends very much on the individual organism. So the larger organisms, for instance, are less affected by some oil as organisms that are in a larval state. So we have a strong influence on smaller organisms. We have a strong influence of gelatinous organisms that can incorporate these hydrocarbons more easily than, for instance, mollusks that can close up.
Although we didn't see any solid masses of oil on the seafloor, we did see increasing concentrations of petroleum and especially PAHs the closer you got to the wellhead. And we didn't really have enough samples directly around the wellhead to estimate a degradation rate. But the repeated sampling we did do near the well and in the deeper parts of the northern Gulf did show degradation rates over time. So even though it was cold down there, any of the dissolved oil that reached the sediment floor, those PAHs were degrading over time, just as they were on the continental shelf.
Is there any research being done for the human impact on human health?
Can you repeat the question just before you start answering into the microphone?
Okay, so the question was whether there was research done on the human health and human impact. Yes, there was. There were some surveys going on, especially also on the coastal population of people that were tightly linked to fisheries, and also there were surveys of people that would consume fish from the Gulf. What we found in our study, we did a limited study on health effects, that there was no pronounced health effect directly from the oil spill. Now, that was very short-lived or a very short investigation that we did at the very beginning. These substances that are in the oil, you can say there's a threshold. If you go beyond the threshold, then it's toxic and can have negative effects. But what also needs to be observed, that there's a cumulative effect. So even if you have substances that are not reaching that threshold, if you pick them up over time and they accumulate because, for instance, you are in an oiled area for long time periods, or you live there, or you eat a lot of seafood that is exposed, then of course you may reach also levels that can affect your health.
So the reason I'm asking is because just on my street, I have 8 houses. 6 of the houses have cancer. With big shellfish eaters, we play in the bay, and I lost my dad, and my husband, and we didn't really think about it. I believe that in Corexit is toxic. It's been so kind of why you choose. I also spoke to a gentleman who was retired Coast Guard. They were brought in to do cleanup. It was so hot. He said everybody but him held off their suits and jacket gear. They all got sick but him. He was the one that kept his own.
So with regard to whether or not there's actually human health studies going on, there's multiple studies that are going on. This panel is not necessarily the group that's going to necessarily be the best suited to answer specific human health issues, though you're welcome to take on this question as well. But if you contact us or sign up for our mailing list, there are a number of different studies and different consortia throughout the Gulf that are doing long-term health monitoring of different communities down in the Gulf Coast and looking at potential rates of illness, whether it's in the response communities, smaller communities that are big shellfish eaters. So those studies are going on.
Hi, thank you everybody for your input. This question is for Cheryl. Cheryl, you said about 3 different times during your talk that Corexit had a very low toxicity.
Yes.
Studies that have come out recently have shown that it makes the Corexit dispersant has things in it that are terrible, like 2-butoxy ethanol,
yes.
and a bunch of things that are not good for human health. Yeah. We have studies showing it making the oil 52 times more toxic. So if you can explain to me how it's low toxicity, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, at the time that the dispersant was actually added to the water, it was considered. Sure. So the question is, how can NOAA make the assertion that Corexit is low toxicity when there have been new studies that have come out to show that it's actually more toxic? My only answer there would be it was considered to be low toxicity back in 2010 and 2011 when we did all the testing for the DOS, but as far as NOAA having any authority as to whether to put the dispersant on the water or not, that was not in our hands, and especially the analytical portion. All we did was just test for the DOS component of the oil, and as long as we found very low levels of that compared to the FDA's level of concern, then it was okay. But we tested probably 12,500 samples from all sorts of species, from all portions of the water column, from crustaceans, pelagic fish, everything. And we were just unable to even find enough of it to make any difference whatsoever. So, but I can't directly address the latest toxicity studies.
The chemical itself does have toxicity. If you put it in your aquarium, you would probably kill some fish. Just like if you put dish detergent in your aquarium, it would probably kill some fish. But the active compound, the active molecule, DOS, you can go to Walgreens and buy this as Dupalax. It's approved for human consumption as a laxative. And so it does have relatively low toxicity to humans. That's been documented over and over and over again. It's FDA approved as an internal medicine for humans.
I just want to make a point. This research is not new. It's been around for a while. And that the Corexit dispersant made the oil more bioavailable in through people's skin, entered their bloodstream, and we're seeing liver, kidney damage, altered blood profiles. All this research is on PubMed. I mean, it's just very prevalent out there. So I just take issue with anybody saying that adding dispersant to oil is an okay thing to do.
Dispersant plus oil does increase bioavailability of oil toxicity.
I'll just make a general health comment. Humans are the one species I don't have to worry about and I'm not supposed to talk about because I'm a vet. But I will say that surfactants in general damage tissue. It's how they can break things down. So dolphins act as a really good proxy for humans because they are long-lived species, they're mammals, they're coastally associated. So by studying the health impacts of the dolphins, which you would think in theory are more highly exposed than coastal people, they live off seafood, you know, shrimp and sardines and stuff, it's at least a decent model for trying to understand the effects of those things on people. So I can speak to the impacts that they've had on dolphins. And I will say that, you know, it's a hard thing to tease out because it's multifactorial. There's multiple stressors and stuff. And we test for the components that we think are of concern. So the active ingredients of these things, but that's not the only thing in these chemicals. So it could be that if there is just a slight bit of something that we're not looking for, that could be the smoking gun that's causing health issues in people or animals. So I think that the standards are made as best as possible to look for the usual suspects that we would anticipate are going to cause health issues in animals. But there are so many things once you put that into the environment, a cascade of effects that happen, that until we actually put it in the environment, we'll never know what's going to happen. So it's good that there's research happening, and all we can do from this point forward is try and make educated decisions on how to manage it. And I know that, or at least from what I understand, one of the decisions of using Corexit was to try and save our coastlines so that we weren't having massive crude oil washing up on our beaches, and it was potentially dispersing it in a way that made it more difficult to clean up potentially, but maybe wouldn't have had as big of an impact on our coastlines, affected our tourism as much, things like that. So it like was said in one of the talks, it's never an easy decision and none of them are good, you know? So you're trying to make the best out of a bad situation and you're gonna have some compromises. So I wouldn't disagree that the Corexit could have increased the toxicity of it at all, but I think it's a hard thing to pin down.
Any more questions? Well, Missy's handing out evaluations. These are evaluations of this particular seminar. Constructive criticism is always welcomed. If there was something you did not particularly like or would think we could do better, please let us know. Again, you guys run our seminars and the things we do as an oil spill team, and we are here to serve our audience, our target audience needs, and so that we get that information from filling out these evaluations. There is a front and a back. They're pretty short. You can fill out whatever you'd like, the whole thing or just part of it, but we would appreciate if you can provide as much information as possible. And for those that are online, Tara is going to go ahead and put the link to the evaluation in the chat box where you could just click on it, and it will pop up an electronic version of the exact same evaluation, and we will get those online through Qualtrics to ourselves. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of our speakers who were able to come and make this seminar such a great event. I appreciated all the science and information that was shared, and I really appreciate you all taking your time from your day to help us and come and speak to these folks. So with that, thank you very much, and you all have a good rest of your day.